The first time Gideon Crane, the Duke of Withycombe, laid eyes on Constance Abbott, she was in the process of being publicly erased. The occasion was the annual Marley Assembly, a crush of silk, sweat, and simmering ambition. And Constance was a ghost at the feast. She did not wear the fashionable pale shades of the season. Her gown was a deep, unassuming grey, the fabric good, but the style at least 2 years old. It was a dress designed not to be seen, and in this it was a resounding success. Her hair, a plain brown, was pinned in a severe knot that did her no favours, and her face, though possessed of a certain quiet intelligence in the set of her jaw and the clarity of her gaze, was deemed utterly unmemorable. They called her too plain for a duke, for a viscount, for even a country solicitor with aspirations. Mostly, they did not call her anything at all. Her aunt, Lady Lavinia Bellamy, held court near the entryway, her powdered face a mask of anxious gaiety. At her side, shimmering like a freshly minted coin, was Constance's younger sister, Flora. Flora was a confection of blonde curls, rose-petal skin, and a smile that promised everything and nothing. She was the family's great hope, the gilded lure cast into the churning waters of the marriage market. Constance was the invisible machinery that made the illusion possible. While Lavinia and Flora had spent the afternoon with dressmakers and hairdressers, Constance had spent it with ledgers. She had calculated, down to the last halfpenny, precisely how much they could afford to spend on the fly-by-night carriage that brought them here, an expense that still tipped their precarious budget into the red. She had been the one to notice the seamstress's overcharge on Flora's gown, a small act of larceny couched in flowery invoices, and had written a polite but firm note that had recovered the sum. She had been the one to mend the fraying lace on her aunt's gloves, her stitches so small and neat as to be indistinguishable from the original. This was her life, a series of quiet, thankless, essential tasks. She was the keeper of keys, the balancer of books, the mender of things, the memory of a household determined to forget its own steady decline. Her parents were gone, lost to a fever that had swept through Little Barton 5 years prior, leaving Constance and Flora as wards of their father's sister. Lavinia, a widow with expensive tastes and a dwindling income, had viewed the girls as liabilities, until she realized Flora's beauty could be monetized. Constance's intelligence, however, was a resource to be exploited in private. A sharp mind in a woman is a tool, Constance, not an ornament, Lavinia had once said, not unkindly. It is best used where it will not frighten the horses. And so, Constance stood by the wall, a glass of tepid lemonade in her hand, and watched. She watched her aunt's eyes darting around the room, assessing the wealth and station of every man who approached. She watched Flora laugh, a tinkling, practiced sound that she had perfected over many hours in front of a mirror. And she watched the other young ladies, the daughters of squires and merchants, preening and posing. She felt no jealousy. She felt a distant, weary sort of pity. They were all playing a part. Constance, at least, knew her role was a fabrication. She was not a lady of leisure. She was an unpaid, unacknowledged steward. And the knowledge, while isolating, gave her a strange and solid sense of self. Then a hush fell over the room. It was not a sudden silence, but a gradual damping of the noise, as if a heavy blanket were being lowered over the assembly. Heads turned. Fans paused their frantic flutter. The Duke of Withycombe had arrived. He was a man made of winter, tall and severe, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to absorb the candlelight without reflecting it. He was not old, perhaps 35, but a profound stillness clung to him, a kind of emotional frost. It was said he had not been seen at a social gathering in Marley for 5 years, not since the death of his young wife. His estate, Kestrel Chase, was a kingdom of silence, vast and wealthy, and, by all accounts, utterly joyless. He acknowledged the host with a curt nod, and then, like Constance, took up a position against the wall, a monolith of black wool and stark linen in a sea of pastels. The room seemed to tilt in his direction. Mothers pushed their daughters forward with hissed whispers and sharp looks. One by one, the season's belles approached, offered a curtsy, and tried to breach the fortress of his solitude. He was impeccably polite and utterly impenetrable. He would incline his head, murmur a single, clipped response, and then the silence would descend again, more profound than before, until the young lady would retreat in a flustered clatter of nerves. Arabella Sinclair, the county's reigning beauty, a stunning brunette with a fortune of her own, made the most determined assault. She was clever and knew it, engaging him not with flirtatious nonsense, but with talk of London politics. Constance watched, an unwilling student of social strategy. She saw the Duke's eyes, cold and analytical, assess Miss Sinclair. He listened, his expression unchanging. When she finally paused, breathless and expectant, he simply said, "Your grasp of the Corn Laws is admirable, Miss Sinclair." There was no warmth in it. It was not a compliment. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same detached finality one might use to describe the weather. Arabella's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered. But the crack had shown. She, too, eventually withdrew. Lavinia, seeing her chance, propelled a reluctant Flora toward the Duke. "Go on, child. Just a curtsy. Let him see you." Flora, who thrived on easy adoration, was visibly intimidated. She approached, dipped into a flawless curtsy, and stammered something about the honor of his presence. The Duke looked down at her, his gaze sweeping over the perfect picture she presented. For a moment, Constance felt a surge of protectiveness. He was too much for Flora. He was a hawk, and she was a wren. But his response was simply a nod, nothing more. Flora scurried back to Lavinia's side, pale and shaken. The evening wore on. The musicians struck up a waltz, the floor filled with swirling couples. The Duke did not move. He did not dance. He simply stood and watched, a judge presiding over a spectacle he found faintly contemptible. And it was then, in a moment of shared stillness at the edges of the room, that his eyes met Constance's. It was not a glance. It was a collision. She had been observing him with the same dispassionate intensity with which she observed everything, cataloging the fine cut of his coat, the tension in his jaw, the way his hands, though relaxed at his sides, seemed capable of immense force. She had expected him to look through her, as everyone else did. He did not. For a long, suspended breath, his gaze held hers. There was no flicker of interest, no social pleasantry in his expression. It was a look of pure, unadorned recognition, as if he saw not the plain girl in the gray dress, but the fellow watcher on the wall. He saw the stillness. He saw the calculation. He saw a creature, like himself, who was in this room, but not of it. Then he gave the barest, most infinitesimal nod, a precise echo of the one he had given Flora, yet it felt entirely different. It was not a dismissal. It was an acknowledgement. Then he turned his head, and the moment was over. Constance's heart, a muscle usually under her complete control, gave a strange, unwelcome lurch. She brought a hand to her chest, feeling the beat of it against her palm. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. But for the first time in a very long time, she felt seen. And it was the most terrifying and exhilarating feeling she had ever known. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. She registered nothing else, only the memory of that brief, silent exchange, a single point of heat in the cold expanse of her life. The incident at the Marley Assembly was filed away in Constance's mind, a curious anomaly, and life at Bramblehurst Park, her aunt's crumbling manor, resumed its familiar, grinding rhythm. Days were measured in shillings saved and small disasters averted. A week after the ball, the encounter was almost forgotten, eclipsed by the more pressing matter of a leaking roof in the West Wing and a butcher's bill that was 3 months overdue. It was during a walk in the neglected gardens, her one permissible escape, that the Duke of Withycombe re-entered her world. Not in person, but as a topic of urgent speculation. She was not meant to be walking in the gardens of Merrowdean, a neighboring estate, but its owner was in London, and its head gardener, a grizzled man named Hobb, had a fondness for her late father, a passionate amateur botanist. Constance carried her father's sketchbook with her always. It was a small, battered volume, filled with his precise drawings of plants, his spidery notes on their properties, and pressed flowers that had faded to the color of ghosts. It was her most precious possession, a tangible link to a man who had valued her mind and encouraged her curiosity. She had found Hobb by the greenhouses, wringing his hands over a row of potted plants. "It's the Duchess's pride, miss," he said, his face creased with worry. "A gift for the master from a foreign prince, they say. And look at them, wilting. I've tried everything." Constance leaned closer, her gaze sharp and focused. The leaves were yellowing at the edges, and the stems drooped. She gently touched a leaf, feeling its texture. She opened her father's sketchbook to a page depicting a similar-looking orchid. "You are giving them too much sun, Hobb," she said, her voice quiet but certain. "And the soil is wrong. The book says it's an epiphyte. It grows on other trees, not in the ground. It needs bark and charcoal, not rich loam. And it prefers shade, deep shade." Hobb looked from the sketchbook to her face, his expression one of dawning respect. "Your father's learning, miss. It's in you, plain as day." It was at that moment, as Hobb began to thank her profusely, that a voice, low and resonant, cut through the quiet afternoon. "He is correct. You have your father's eye for detail." Constance froze. She turned slowly. Gideon Crane, the Duke of Withycombe, was standing not 20 feet away, partially concealed by a large yew hedge. He must have been walking the grounds, his own estate of Kestrel Chase bordering Merrowdean. He stepped out from the shadows. He was dressed for the country, in a riding coat and boots, but he seemed no less formidable than he had in the ballroom. If anything, the stark light of day made him more real, more intimidating. Hobb immediately tugged his forelock, stammering, "Your Grace, I didn't see you." "Evidently," the Duke said, his voice dry. His eyes, however, were not on the gardener. They were on Constance, and on the small, worn book in her hands. "You were saying it prefers shade." It was not a question. It was a prompt to continue. Constance found her voice. It came out steadier than she expected. Yes, Your Grace, and a different substrate. It is native to forests, where it receives only dappled light through a high canopy. She spoke of the plant as if it were the only other thing in the world. It was safer than meeting his gaze. The yellowing of the leaves is a sign of phototoxicity, a burn. I see, he said. And Constance had the unnerving feeling that he did. He saw not just the plant, but the knowledge behind her words, the years of quiet study, the precise memory. He looked from her to the wilting orchid, then back again. The owner of this estate is a fool to let such a specimen perish from simple ignorance. He said it as a flat statement of fact. Then his gaze settled on the sketchbook. May I? He did not wait for an answer, but took a step closer. He did not reach for the book, but simply looked down at it where she held it, forcing her to tilt it up toward him. His proximity was overwhelming. He smelled of leather and cold air, and something else, something clean and elemental like rain on stone. He studied her father's drawing for a long moment. His face was unreadable, a mask of aristocratic control. The handwriting is clear, the drawing precise, a man of science. He was a country doctor, Constance said softly. But botany was his passion. Competence is a passion in itself, the Duke murmured, almost to himself. He straightened up, the moment of shared inspection over. He looked at Constance, and again she felt that unnerving sense of being truly seen. You have prevented a loss, Miss Abbott. Merodine's owner and his gardener are in your debt. He gave a curt nod, not just to her, but also including the flustered Hob, and then he turned and walked away, his long strides eating up the gravel path. He did not look back. Constance stood frozen, her fingers clutching the sketchbook so tightly the edges dug into her palm. Hob was staring after the Duke, his mouth agape. "The Duke," he whispered, as if the title itself were a magical incantation. "Spoke to you? Plain as anything." Constance said nothing. She could still feel the phantom heat of the Duke's presence, the intensity of his focus. It was not warmth. It was something far more potent, a pure, distilled attention. He had not complimented her appearance. He had not engaged in flirtatious banter. He had recognized her skill. It was more intoxicating than any pretty lie she had ever heard. That night, as she lay in her narrow bed, listening to the familiar groan of the old house, she did not think of the leaking roof or the unpaid bills. She thought of a pair of cold, intelligent eyes and a low voice saying, "Competence is a passion in itself." She thought of the man who had looked at her plain face and seen not a deficit, but a mind at work. And for the second time, her heart performed its strange, rebellious lurch, a traitorous flutter in the quiet fortress of her chest. The Duke's brief, strange attentions were a stone dropped into the placid, murky pond of Constance's existence. The ripples, however, were about to become a tidal wave. Lady Lavinia's financial situation, always precarious, had become critical. A letter arrived from a creditor in London, his language stripped of all politeness, threatening not just legal action, but public exposure. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced Lavinia's carefully constructed facade. For 2 days, she remained locked in her room. When she emerged, her face was pale, but her eyes held a new, frightening resolve. She had a plan. And like all of Lavinia's plans, it centered on Flora's beauty and revolved around Constance's silent sacrifice. The plan became clear a week later. A formal carriage, bearing the crest of the Duke of Withercombe, rolled up the weed-choked drive of Bramblehurst Park. It was not the Duke himself, but his man of business, a severe-looking solicitor named Mr. Jardine, who carried a heavy leather portfolio. Lavinia received him in the drawing-room, the one room in the house that still retained a ghost of its former grandeur. Flora was positioned on a chaise lounge, a vision in pale blue, while Constance was instructed to serve the tea and then make herself scarce. But as she was about to withdraw, Mr. Jardine cleared his throat. "Lady Bellamy, my instructions were to speak with you and with both of your nieces." Lavinia's painted smile tightened. "My niece Flora is here. Constance, you may stay." Constance took a seat on a hard-backed chair near the door, her hands folded in her lap. Mr. Jardine opened his portfolio and got straight to the point, his voice as dry as the legal documents he handled. "His Grace the Duke of Withycombe is aware of certain financial embarrassments connected to this estate." Lavinia paled. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." "Please, madam," Mr. Jardine said with a flicker of impatience. "His Grace does not deal in pretenses. He is aware of the mortgage on this property, the outstanding notes from 3 separate lenders, and the significant credit extended by several local tradesmen." He recited the figures, a litany of debt that Constance knew by heart. She had tallied them herself in the back of her ledger, a secret accounting of their ruin. Lavinia looked as if she might faint. Flora simply looked confused. "His Grace," Mr. Jardine continued, his gaze flicking briefly to Flora and then settling with unnerving focus on Constance, "is prepared to make a most generous offer. He proposes to settle in full every last one of these debts. He will also provide an annuity for you, Lady Bellamy, and a respectable dowry for your younger niece, Miss Flora Abbott." A wave of shock and relief washed over Lavinia's face. "The Duke! Oh, the dear, generous man! I knew he was taken with my Flora at the assembly. I knew it." Flora blushed, a flutter of excitement animating her features. She was to be a duchess. It was the fairy tale ending she had been raised to expect. Constance felt a cold knot form in her stomach. This was too easy. The Duke was not a man who engaged in acts of spontaneous, romantic charity. There had to be a price. Mr. Jardine held up a hand, silencing Lavinia's effusions. "The Duke's generosity is, as you might expect, conditional." Of course, anything," Lavinia chirped. The solicitor's eyes rested on Constance again. "His Grace's proposal is for the hand of your elder niece, Miss Constance Abbott." The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock. Flora's jaw dropped. Lavinia stared as if Mr. Jardine had just announced the sky was turning green. She looked from the solicitor to Constance, her expression a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. "Constance?" she whispered, the name a question, an accusation. "But she's so very plain." Mr. Jardine's face remained impassive. His Grace was very specific. "The offer is for Miss Constance Abbott. In return for her hand in marriage, all debts are cleared and the aforementioned settlements are made. The terms are not negotiable." He slid a document across the table. "This is a contract, Lady Bellamy, not a sonnet. The Duke requires a duchess. He has made his selection." Constance felt the blood drain from her face. It was not a proposal of love. It was a transaction, a purchase. He was buying a manager for his estate, a competent mind to oversee his cold, silent house. He had seen her in the garden, not as a woman, but as a useful instrument. The humiliation was a sharp, metallic taste in her mouth. And yet, beneath the humiliation, another feeling stirred. A cold, clear-eyed calculation that was a mirror of the Duke's own. If she refused, What was the alternative? Ruin. Public disgrace. Lavinia would sell Flora to the first wealthy brute who would have her, to settle the debts. They would all be cast out, destitute. If she accepted, she would be free. Free of Lavinia's tyranny. Free of the endless, thankless toil of keeping this sinking ship afloat. She would be exchanging one form of servitude for another, but this new one came with power, with security, with the magnificent, cold emptiness of Kestrel Chase, a place she felt she already understood. She looked at her aunt's horrified face, at her sister's bewildered disappointment. She thought of her father's sketchbook and the quiet satisfaction of solving a problem. I accept. The words were out before she had fully formed the thought. They hung in the air, quiet and irrevocable. Lavinia gasped. "Constance, you can't be serious. Marry the Duke? You? It's preposterous." "It is a business arrangement, Aunt," Constance said, her voice even. "As Mr. Jardine has made clear, the Duke requires a duchess who can manage his affairs. It seems he believes I am qualified for the position." She stood up, her posture straight, her hands steady. She looked directly at the solicitor. "Please inform His Grace that I accept his terms, plainly and without reservation." Mr. Jardine looked at her, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than professional detachment showed in his eyes. It might have been respect. "Very good, Miss Abbott," he said, gathering his papers. "His Grace will be pleased by your clarity. The wedding will be in 1 week, a private ceremony at the chapel at Kestrel Chase. His Grace does not care for fuss." And with that, he was gone, leaving Constance in the wreckage of her old life, on the terrifying precipice of the new. Flora burst into tears of thwarted ambition, and Lavinia sank into a chair, muttering, "A duchess. Plain Constance, a duchess. The world has gone mad." Constance simply stood by the window, watching the Duke's carriage disappear down the drive, feeling not like a bride, but like a general who had just signed a treaty, ending one war and preparing for the next. The wedding was as stark and unadorned as the man she was marrying. There was no white gown, no shower of flowers, no crowd of well-wishers. Constance wore a simple dress of dark blue velvet, a traveling dress, practical and severe. She had been delivered to Kestrel Chase that morning like a piece of valuable, carefully packaged cargo. Lady Lavinia had wept, not from sentiment, but from the sheer theatricality of the moment. Flora had been sullen and silent. The farewell had been a relief. Kestrel Chase was even more imposing up close. It was a vast, sprawling edifice of gray stone, beautiful in its austere symmetry, but radiating a palpable chill. It looked less like a home and more like a mausoleum. The ceremony took place in the estate's private chapel, a small, cold space that smelled of stone dust and old incense. The only attendees were Mr. Jardine and a woman Constance assumed was the housekeeper, a tall, severe figure with iron-gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull her face taut. The Duke was waiting at the altar. He wore the same black he favored, the severity of it making him seem carved from granite. He did not smile when she approached. He simply watched her, his gaze as intense and analytical as ever. The vows were exchanged in clipped, quiet tones. They sounded less like a sacred promise and more like the reading of a contractual clause. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, there was an awkward pause. The Duke did not lean in to kiss her. He simply took her right hand, his grip firm and cool, and turned to face the two witnesses. "It is done," he said. The finality in his voice was chilling. He led her from the chapel, his hand still on her arm, a gesture not of affection, but of possession. He walked her through silent, echoing corridors, their footsteps the only sound. The portraits of his ancestors, a long line of stern-faced men and pale, unhappy-looking women, watched them pass. Finally, they arrived at a large, handsome library. A fire had been lit in the grate, but it did little to dispel the room's gloom. "We will speak plainly, Duchess," Gideon said, releasing her arm and moving to stand before the fireplace. He did not use the title to mock her, but as a simple statement of her new station. "You and I." "I would prefer that, Your Grace," Constance replied, her voice steady. He gestured to a chair. "This is not a marriage of affection. You know this. I know this. There will be no pretense between us. I have given you my name and my protection. I have secured your family. In return, I require one thing from you: competence. This house, this estate, it has been without a true mistress for 5 years. It has fallen into disarray." Disarray, Constance thought, was a mild word for the pervasive sense of neglect she felt pressing in on all sides. "My late wife," he continued, his voice going flat, "was not suited to the task. She was a creature of light and air. These practical matters, they burdened her." He stared into the fire, his face a mask of old, cold grief. "I will not have this house burden you. I expect it to obey you. The staff are yours to command. The ledgers are yours to manage. The keys are yours to keep." He crossed to a massive oak desk and picked up a heavy iron ring, laden with keys of all shapes and sizes. He held it out to her. "This is your domain. I will not interfere. My work is in London and with my tenants. I require a home that runs silently and efficiently in my absence. I require peace. Can you provide that?" Constance looked at the keys. They were a symbol of her new prison and her new power. She stepped forward and took them from his hand. Their fingers brushed. A jolt, sharp and unexpected, passed between them. His skin was cold, but there was a strange energy beneath it, a tightly coiled tension. "Yes," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I can." "Good," he said, stepping back. "Your rooms are in the east wing. Mine are in the west. We will dine together this evening at 8. After that, our paths need not cross unless duty requires it." It was a dismissal. Her husband of 10 minutes was dismissing her. Constance felt a strange, hollow feeling in her chest. It was not disappointment. One could not be disappointed when one had no expectations. It was something else, a vast, lonely emptiness. She nodded, turned, and walked out of the library, the heavy keys clutched in her hand. The cold iron felt solid, real. It was a starting point. Her first week as the Duchess of Withercombe was a silent battle of wills. The staff, long accustomed to neglect and the lax authority of a grieving master, were polite but resistant. They moved with a leaden slowness, their faces closed and watchful. The housekeeper, whose name she learned was Hannah, was the most formidable. She ran the household on a system of her own devising, one that was inefficient and wasteful, but it was hers. Constance did not confront her directly. That was not her way. She began as she always did, by observing, She walked the house, from the dusty, disused ballrooms to the cavernous, disorganized kitchens. She said little, but she saw everything. The fine layer of dust on the banisters, the mildew creeping in the corners of the pantry, the good linen being used for rags. She did not issue grand pronouncements. She started with the keys. She went to the linen closet, a room as large as her entire bedroom at Bramblehurst, and found it in chaos. Silks were piled with woolens. Fine damask tablecloths were crushed beneath heavy horse blankets. With her own 2 hands, she began to sort. She spent an entire day in that room, cataloging, folding, arranging. The young maids watched her from the doorway, whispering amongst themselves. A duchess doing the work of a scullery maid. Hannah eventually appeared, her face a thundercloud. "Your Grace, this is not work for you." "It is the work of this house," Constance replied calmly, not looking up from the tablecloth she was folding. "And this house is now my responsibility. If you wish to assist me, you may fetch the lavender and cedar from the still room. We will protect the woolens from the moths." Hannah stared, nonplussed. It was not a command, but an invitation to competence. After a long, tense moment, the housekeeper gave a short, sharp nod and left. She returned 20 minutes later with the requested herbs. It was the first crack in the wall of her resistance. Next, Constance turned her attention to the kitchens. The ledgers showed extravagant spending on meat and wine. Yet the meals that appeared on the solitary dining table, where she and the Duke ate their silent dinners, were bland and uninspired. She entered the kitchens one morning to find the cook, a fleshy, bad-tempered man named Perkin, berating a young kitchen boy for dropping a side of beef. Constance waited until he was finished. Then, in the ensuing silence, she said, "Perkin, the household accounts for last month show we purchased 24 bottles of French brandy, yet the Duke takes only claret. Where has the brandy gone?" The cook turned purple. The entire kitchen staff froze. It is for medicinal purposes, Your Grace." "Indeed," Constance said, her voice cool. "Show me the 24 patients." There was a snort of laughter from one of the maids, quickly suppressed. Perkin paled. He knew he was caught. Constance did not fire him. Instead, she handed him a new, leaner budget. "From now on, I will approve all orders personally, and I will expect an accounting for every bottle and every bird. Do you understand?" He understood. From that day on, the meals improved, and the household expenses dropped by 1/3. Her one personal indulgence was the garden. Behind the main house, choked with weeds and forgotten, were a series of magnificent glass houses. They were in disrepair, panes of glass broken, the structures themselves succumbing to rust and rot. But inside, fighting for life, were the remnants of a once great collection of exotic plants. It was here that Constance felt a flicker of something akin to joy. Using her father's sketchbook as her guide, she began the painstaking work of reclamation. She found an old gardener, a man named Tam, who remembered the gardens in their glory days and still possessed the skill to repair the structures. Together, they began to bring the greenhouses back to life. She would spend hours there, her hands in the soil, coaxing dormant seeds to sprout, nursing sickly plants back to health. It was quiet, demanding work, and it soothed a part of her soul that the cold grandeur of the house could not reach. Gideon watched all of this from a distance. He said nothing, but he noticed. He noticed the gleam of polished wood on the grand staircase. He noticed the scent of beeswax and lemon that had replaced the faint odor of dust and decay. He noticed the food, which was suddenly, surprisingly delicious. He saw the household accounts, which she left for him to review every Friday, and saw the sharp downward trend in expenditure coupled with a clear rise in quality. He saw a mind at work, a quiet, relentless intelligence imposing order on chaos. One evening, he came back from a long ride and found his way to the greenhouses. He stood in the shadows, watching her. She was on her knees, her face smudged with dirt, carefully repotting an orchid. She was talking to it, a low, gentle murmur. She looked not happy. Happy was too simple a word. She looked content. She looked like she belonged. A strange, unfamiliar feeling stirred in his chest. It was not the cold grief he was used to. It was not the numb emptiness. It was something else. Something warm and dangerously close to admiration. He had bought a manager. He was beginning to suspect he had acquired something far more valuable and far more complicated. From the perspective of Gideon Crane, Duke of Withercombe, the silence of Kestrel Chase had been his sanctuary. After Eleanor's death, the noise of the world had become unbearable. The condolences, the pitying looks, the well-meaning advice, it was all a grating cacophony. He had retreated into the quiet, into the vast, empty rooms of his ancestral home, and pulled the silence around him like a shroud. For 5 years, it had been enough. It had been a state of suspended animation, a long, gray numbness that passed for peace. He had forgotten what a living house sounded like. Now, he was being reminded. It was not a loud becoming. It was a series of quiet, almost imperceptible shifts. The hiss of a log catching in the fireplace was cleaner, sharper. The tick of the grandfather clock in the hall seemed to have a steadier, more reassuring rhythm. The air itself tasted different, cleaner, laced with the faint, pleasant sense of polish and herbs and baking bread. His new duchess was a creature of silence, but her silence was of a different quality than his. His was an absence, a void. Hers was a presence, a focused, potent stillness. He had known from the moment he saw her at the Marley Assembly. Surrounded by screeching peacocks, she had been a hawk, perched on the wall, observing, assessing. Her plainness, the very quality that made her invisible to others, had made her stand out to him. It was a sign of substance over style, a refusal to engage in the glittering, vapid performance of the marriage market. He had found himself disgusted by the fawning, the false smiles, the desperate ambition. Then his eyes had met hers, and he had seen a fellow prisoner, someone who understood the mechanics of the cage. The incident in the garden at Merrodene had solidified his decision. It was not just that she was intelligent. He had known that from the inquiries he'd made. It was the nature of her intelligence. It was practical. It was applied. She saw a problem, the wilting orchid, and she knew the solution. She did not preen or boast. She simply stated the facts. He had been looking for a duchess for months, urged on by his solicitors and the relentless pressure of his title. He needed an heir. He needed a mistress for his house. He had interviewed, in his own detached way, a dozen candidates. They were all the same, beautiful, accomplished, and utterly useless. They spoke of poetry and watercolors. They simpered and flattered. He imagined them at Kestrel Chase, filling his silence with pointless chatter, with demands for new gowns and trips to London. The thought was exhausting. Constance Abbott was different. He knew the stories. The unpaid steward of a bankrupt house, the quiet workhorse behind her sister's glittering facade. He did not pity her. Pity was a useless, condescending emotion. He respected her. He saw a fellow pragmatist, trapped by circumstance. So he had made her an offer, a contract, as cold and clear as he could make it. He had expected her to be grateful, perhaps a little frightened. He had not expected her quiet, unhesitating acceptance. I accept his terms, plainly and without reservation. His solicitor had reported her words, and Gideon had felt a flicker of something he had not felt in years: intrigue. Now she was here, and she was magnificent. Not in the way the world understood the word. She was not beautiful. She did not charm. She did not try to fill his silence with her own. Instead, she seemed to understand it, to inhabit it alongside him. She was transforming his house not through redecoration or grand pronouncements, but through 1,000 small acts of quiet competence. She moved through Kestrel Chase like a physician, diagnosing its ills and prescribing the cure. She had dealt with the corrupt cook, reorganized the chaotic linen stores, and brought the household accounts into perfect, logical order. He would review the ledgers she left for him each week, and it was like reading a masterful piece of prose. Every entry was clear, every expense justified, every saving noted. It was, in its own way, a thing of beauty. He found himself watching her. He would alter his routines just for a chance to observe her unnoticed. He saw her in the library, not reading novels, but studying books on crop rotation and estate management. He saw her speaking with the tenants, not with the condescending charity of a noblewoman, but with the focused attention of a partner, listening to their concerns about drainage and fences. And he saw her in the derelict glasshouses, her hands in the dirt, a smudge of soil on her cheek, her face animated with a concentration so profound it was almost a form of prayer. He had offered her a kingdom of keys and ledgers. She was turning it into a living, breathing world. The silence of Kestrel Chase was changing. It was no longer the dead silence of a tomb. It was the quiet, humming silence of a well-oiled machine, of a garden in the moments before dawn, pregnant with life. He had married her for competence. He was beginning to understand that he had stumbled upon something far more dangerous: character. And it was slowly, inexorably, pulling him back into the world of the living. He was not yet sure if he was grateful or terrified. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The quiet hum of Kestrel Chase was a fragile piece, and Constance knew it. Her success within the walls of the estate had not gone unnoticed by the world outside. Whispers followed the Duke and Duchess on their rare appearances at church or in the town of Marley. The county, having dismissed Constance as a non-entity, was now forced to acknowledge her as its highest-ranking lady. They did not do so gracefully. The prevailing narrative, fanned by the bitter winds of gossip, was that the plain, clever spinster had somehow trapped the grieving Duke. It was a narrative championed by two particularly aggrieved parties, Arabella Sinclair and Lady Lavinia Bellamy. Arabella, who had considered the Duke her prize to be won, could not abide her humiliation. That Gideon Crane had passed over her, with her beauty, wit, and fortune, for a drab nobody like Constance Abbott, was an insult she could not forgive. She took to speaking of Constance with a kind of honeyed pity. "Poor thing," she would say, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "She tries so hard, but Kestrel Chase needs a true hostess, not a housekeeper. The Duke is so isolated. One fears she is not equipped to bring him out of his shell." The words were poison, delivered with a smile. Lady Lavinia, meanwhile, was furious. The Duke had honored his contract, settling her debts and providing her with a comfortable annuity, but he had done so with a cold, impersonal efficiency that made the transaction feel like a rebuke. She had expected to be welcomed at Kestrel Chase, to become the dowager in residence, the power behind her niece's throne. Instead, she had been politely but firmly kept at arm's length. Her invitations to the estate went unanswered. Her letters to Constance received only brief, formal replies. Robbed of her proximity to power, she grew resentful. She began to tell stories of Constance's childhood, painting her as a cold, calculating girl who had always been jealous of her beautiful sister. Constance was aware of the rumors. She heard them in the averted eyes of the shopkeepers in Marley, in the sudden silences that fell when she entered a room. They did not hurt her. She had been underestimated her whole life. It was familiar territory. Her concern was for the Duke. His name was being tarnished alongside hers, his judgment questioned. One evening, as they sat at their long dining table, a copy of the London Gazette lay beside his plate. A gossip column, penned by a writer known for his vicious wit, contained a thinly veiled account of their marriage, describing a northern duke of melancholic temperament who had been ensnared by a governess in grey. Gideon read it without expression, then folded the paper neatly and set it aside. "The ink of fools," he said, his voice level. "It fades quickly." But Constance saw the muscle tighten in his jaw. The attack had found its mark. The opposition began to escalate from whispers to actions. A delivery of seed for the spring planting, ordered by Constance, failed to arrive. Inquiries revealed it had been mysteriously cancelled. A prize bull, meant to improve the estate's herd, was lamed in its paddock overnight, the gate left carelessly unlatched. These were small acts of sabotage, impossible to trace, designed to undermine her authority and make her appear incompetent. Constance documented everything, her notes precise, her resolve hardening. She knew this was not random misfortune. It was a coordinated campaign. The architect of it, she suspected, was a man named Fletcher Ingram, the former estate steward whom Gideon had dismissed a year before his marriage. She had seen his name in the old ledgers, a trail of mismanagement and petty theft behind him. He was a man with a grievance. The final piece of the plot fell into place when, during a visit to Marley, Constance saw Ingram in deep, quiet conversation with Arabella Sinclair outside the draper's shop. Their heads were bent together, their manner conspiratorial. When they saw her carriage approach, they sprang apart, their faces a study in guilt. Constance said nothing, her expression unreadable as her carriage rolled past, but her mind was racing. An aggrieved ex-employee, a humiliated rival, and a resentful aunt. The ingredients for a truly spectacular disaster were all in place. She returned to Kestrel Chase with a sense of foreboding, a feeling that the quiet war she had been fighting was about to erupt into open conflict. She found herself looking at her husband across the dinner table that night, a new and urgent question in her mind. He trusted her competence, he respected her mind, but did he trust her? The foundation of their strange, silent partnership was about to be tested, and she feared it would not be strong enough to withstand the storm that was coming. The storm broke on a Tuesday. It arrived in the form of a letter, delivered by special messenger from the Duke's London solicitor. Gideon received it in his study and was closeted there for over an hour. When he emerged, his face was like a thunderhead, dark and turbulent. He found Constance in the library, where she was comparing the new household accounts with the previous years. He did not speak. He simply walked to the large mahogany table where she was working and placed a single sheet of paper on top of her ledger. It was a page that had been crudely torn from a book, a ledger page. It showed a series of withdrawals from the estate's main account, culminating in a single, large sum of £500 transferred to a bank in Little Barton, the town where her aunt and sister still lived. The entry was dated 2 weeks prior, and the handwriting was a flawless imitation of her own. Alongside the page, he placed a sworn statement. It was from Fletcher Ingram, the disgraced former steward. In it, Ingram claimed that he had been approached by the new Duchess. She was desperate, he said, to funnel money to her family, to pay off secret gambling debts her aunt had accrued. She had used her access to the accounts to embezzle the funds, and had tried to enlist Ingram to help her cover her tracks. He, as an honest man, had refused. It was a neat, vicious, and plausible lie. Constance was known to be loyal to her family. Her aunt's financial instability was common knowledge, and the handwriting on the ledger page was, to any casual observer, hers. Constance looked at the documents, her mind working with cold, rapid precision. She saw the trap, every detail of its cruel and clever construction. She felt a surge of pure, white-hot anger, but she forced it down. Panic was a luxury she could not afford. She looked up at her husband. His face was unreadable, his eyes dark and shuttered. For the first time since her arrival at Kestrel Chase, the silence between them was not comfortable or companionable. It was heavy, charged with suspicion. This was the moment, the crisis, the test of their fragile, unpoken pact. "Explain this," Gideon said. His voice was low, flat, and devoid of all emotion. It was not an accusation, it was a command. He was not asking for tears or protestations of innocence. He was asking for evidence. Constance took a slow, deliberate breath, steadying herself. She would not allow him to see her fear. She would meet this challenge, as she had met every other, with facts. "It is a forgery," she said, her voice as level as his. "A very clever one, but a forgery nonetheless." "Prove it," he said. Not a challenge, but an invitation. She stood up and walked to the bookshelf, her movements calm and measured. She pulled down her own private logbook, the one she had kept since her first day at Kestrel Chase. In it, she documented every decision, every order, every significant conversation. It was the secret ledger of her stewardship. She opened it to the date in question. "On that day, 2 weeks ago," she began, her finger tracing the neat lines of her own true script. "I was not in the accounts office. I was in the West Fields with Tam, the gardener, and 3 of the tenant farmers. We were surveying the drainage ditches that were damaged in the last storm. We were there from 9 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon. The farmers, Mr. Corbett, Mr. Farrow, and Mr. Granger, will all attest to it." She then turned to the main estate ledger, the one from which the page had been torn. She ran her finger along the jagged edge. "This page was not removed by me, but I know who did it." She walked back to her desk and pulled out a different file. It contained the notes she had been compiling on the acts of sabotage. "Fletcher Ingram was dismissed for theft," she said, laying out her evidence piece by piece. "I have reviewed the accounts from his tenure. He was systematically over-ordering supplies and selling the surplus. The total he stole comes to just over £400. He was clever, but not clever enough." She then pulled out another document. It was a report from a contact her father had used, a man in Marley who made his living by knowing things. "I asked for a report on Mr. Ingram's current circumstances. He has recently come into a significant sum of money, enough to pay off his debts and purchase a ticket to America. He sails in 3 days." Finally, she addressed the forged ledger page itself.
The handwriting is excellent, but it is not mine. Look." She took a clean sheet of paper and a pen. In her own clear, precise hand, she wrote the same entry as the forgery. "Look at the letter T," she said, her voice gaining strength with every piece of evidence she presented. "I cross my T's with a straight, firm line. The forger's line has a slight upward curve at the end, a flourish. It's a habit of someone who thinks their writing is elegant. Someone like—" She let the sentence hang in the air. Someone like Arabella Sinclair, whose letters were known for their stylish, self-conscious script. She did not need to say the name. Gideon looked from the forged page to the one she had just written. He looked at her logbook, at the report on Ingram, at the files detailing the petty sabotage. He was silent for a long time, his eyes moving over the evidence she had assembled. He was not looking at a hysterical, weeping woman. He was looking at a calm, methodical strategist who had anticipated an attack and prepared her defenses. He had asked for an explanation. She had given him a comprehensive intelligence briefing. He finally raised his eyes from the papers and looked at her. The suspicion in his gaze was gone. In its place was something else, something she had never seen there before. A raw, profound respect. "They underestimated you," he said, his voice quiet. "They thought you were a housekeeper. They did not realize they were declaring war on a general." He reached out and picked up the forged page. With slow, deliberate movements, he tore it into 4 pieces and dropped them into the fire. They watched the elegant forged script blacken and curl into ash. "This is not over," Constance said.
"Ingram is merely a pawn. He was put up to this." "I know," Gideon said. His voice was colder than she had ever heard it. "And we will afford his sponsors the same courtesy they have shown you. A public reckoning." The crisis had passed. Their alliance had not fractured. It had been forged in the fire and had come out stronger, harder, and far more dangerous. Gideon Crane was a man who believed in evidence, and Constance had provided it in abundance. But he also believed in justice, and his version of it was as cold and unyielding as the winter winds that swept across his estate. He did not want a quiet victory. He wanted a public execution, a bloodless but brutal end to the campaign that had been waged against his wife and his house. He began to make arrangements. Invitations were sent, engraved on heavy cream cardstock. His Grace, the Duke of Withycombe, and his Duchess would be hosting a dinner at Kestrel Chase to celebrate their marriage and to formally introduce the Duchess to the county. It was an invitation no one of importance would dare refuse. The guest list was a masterpiece of strategic cruelty. He invited the Lord Lieutenant of the county, the local magistrate, and all the most influential and gossip-loving landowners. And, of course, he extended special, personal invitations to Lady Lavinia Bellamy, Miss Flora Abbott, Miss Arabella Sinclair, and, to the surprise of many, Mr. Fletcher Ingram. Arabella and Lavinia saw the invitation as a sign of victory. Clearly, their scheme had worked. The Duke was casting out his plain little wife, and this dinner was the stage on which he would do it. They imagined Constance would be sent packing before the soup was served, and Arabella would be there to offer the grieving Duke her perfumed condolences. Fletcher Ingram, emboldened by his perceived success and the promise of a final payout, agreed to attend. He saw it as a victory lap before his departure to America.
Constance and Gideon planned the evening with the meticulous care of two generals planning a decisive battle. Constance oversaw the menu, the seating chart, the flowers, creating an atmosphere of flawless, effortless elegance. The house was to be her fortress, its perfection a testament to her command. Gideon, meanwhile, worked with his solicitors, gathering the final pieces of his case. They were a formidable team, their silent partnership now an active, humming alliance. The night of the dinner, Kestrel Chase gleamed. Every surface was polished to a mirror shine. Hundreds of candles banished every shadow, and the air was filled with the scent of beeswax and roses from the newly revived gardens. Constance stood beside her husband in the grand entryway, greeting their guests. She wore a gown of deep emerald velvet, the color of the dress bringing out the hidden flecks of green in her hazel eyes. Her hair was styled simply but elegantly, and she wore a single piece of jewelry, a magnificent diamond and emerald necklace that had belonged to Gideon's grandmother. It was a statement. She was not a housekeeper. She was the Duchess, and this was her house. When Arabella Sinclair arrived, she paused for a fraction of a second, her eyes widening at the sight of Constance's transformation. The plain gray mouse was gone. In her place stood a woman of poise and power. A flicker of doubt crossed Arabella's beautiful face, but it was quickly replaced by her usual confident smile. Lady Lavinia arrived with Flora, Lavinia preening as if she were the host, Flora looking pale and nervous. They were all seated at a magnificent long table in the state dining room. The seating chart was a work of art. Constance had placed Arabella next to a deaf old baronet, and Lady Lavinia across from a famously blunt dowager, Theodosia Drummond, a woman who had seen through Lavinia's pretensions for years. Fletcher Ingram was seated at the far end of the table, looking smug and out of place. The dinner was a triumph.
The food was exquisite, the wine superb. Gideon was a surprisingly attentive host, and Constance, at his side, was gracious and composed. As the port was being served, a hush fell over the room. Gideon rose to his feet, a wine glass in his hand. "My lords, ladies, and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "I thank you for joining us tonight to celebrate my marriage. It has come to my attention, however, that some in the county have questions about the wisdom of my choice." A ripple of nervous whispers went through the room. Arabella leaned forward, a predatory gleam in her eye. This was it. "There have been rumors," Gideon continued, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. "Ugly rumors. Slanders against my wife's character. Accusations of theft and deceit." He turned his cold gaze on Fletcher Ingram. "Mr. Ingram, you were once a steward of this estate. You have recently made a sworn statement accusing my wife of embezzlement. As you are a man who prides himself on his honesty, I invite you to repeat your accusation now, before these witnesses." All eyes turned to Ingram. He paled, but he was trapped. He stood, his voice trembling slightly, and repeated the story he had been paid to tell, of the Duchess's desperation, the secret debts, the forged ledger. When he was finished, Gideon did not speak. He simply nodded to a footman who opened the door to reveal Mr. Jardine, the solicitor, and 3 hard-faced tenant farmers, their hats clutched in their hands. "Mr. Corbett," Gideon said, "on the day in question, where was my wife, the Duchess?" "In the West Fields with us, Your Grace," the farmer said, his voice rough but clear.
from sun up to nearly sundown. We was mapping the new drainage." Gideon then had Mr. Jardine present the evidence. The report on Ingram's own thefts, the proof of his sudden wealth, the ticket for a ship to America booked under a false name. The case against Ingram was overwhelming, his guilt laid bare for all to see. The magistrate, who was sitting near Gideon, looked grim. Ingram began to sweat, his face turning a pasty white. "But the ledger," Arabella interjected, her voice sharp with desperation. "The forgery! The handwriting was hers!" "Ah, yes," Gideon said, turning his icy gaze on her. "The handwriting." He nodded to Mr. Jardine again. The solicitor produced 2 documents. One was a letter from Arabella accepting the dinner invitation. The other was the forged ledger page. "I retained the services of a handwriting expert from London," Gideon said calmly. "He has concluded, with absolute certainty, that the hand that wrote this letter is the same hand that forged this ledger entry. The distinctive upward curve of the letter T was, he noted, a particularly helpful identifier." He let the words hang in the air. The silence was deafening. Arabella Sinclair, the belle of the county, looked as if she had been struck by lightning. Her face, her greatest asset, was a mask of pure, ugly horror. "And finally," Gideon said, his voice now laced with contempt, "the motive." He produced a final document. It was a promissory note, signed by Arabella and Lady Lavinia, promising to pay Fletcher Ingram the sum of £1,000 upon the dissolution of the Duke's marriage. "It seems you were not only malicious," Gideon said, looking from Arabella to a now sobbing Lavinia, "but foolish." The public reckoning was complete. The humiliation was absolute. Theodosia Drummond, the blunt dowager, summed it up perfectly. "Well," she said, taking a loud sip of her port, "that was more entertaining than the theater, and considerably better catered." The spell was broken. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Arabella Sinclair had fainted, and Lady Lavinia was being led from the room, wailing. Fletcher Ingram was being quietly detained by the magistrate. The battle was over.
And Constance, the plain girl they had all underestimated, stood victorious and untouchable at the center of it all. In the stunned aftermath of the dinner, as the last of the shocked guests made their hasty departures, a strange and profound quiet settled over the great hall of Kestrel Chase. The servants moved silently, clearing away the remnants of the feast, their faces impassive, but their movements imbued with a new kind of respect. They were no longer serving a cold master and his mysterious new wife. They were serving a duke and duchess, who had, before their very eyes, defended their house and their honor with the precision of a surgeon's blade and the force of a tidal wave. Arabella Sinclair had been carried out in a swoon. Lady Lavinia, a broken and pathetic figure, had been bundled into a carriage by a mortified Flora, her wails of theatrical despair echoing down the drive. The magistrate had departed with a grimly satisfied Fletcher Ingram in tow. Justice would be served, swiftly and without mercy. Constance and Gideon stood alone by the great fireplace, the dying embers casting long, flickering shadows on the wall. The emerald necklace was cool against Constance's skin. The battle was won, the victory absolute. But she felt no elation, only a deep, bone-weary exhaustion, and a strange sense of anticlimax. Gideon turned to her. The cold fury that had animated him throughout the evening was gone, replaced by a quiet intensity that was, in its own way, even more powerful. "They will trouble you no more," he said. It was a simple statement of fact, as final and absolute as a royal decree. "Thank you," she said softly. It seemed an inadequate word for what he had done, for the public, unequivocal way he had taken her side. He shook his head. "It is I who should thank you. You armed me. You gave me the truth, and I simply presented it." He looked around the great hall, at the polished wood and gleaming silver, at the quiet, efficient order that she had brought to his world. "They called you plain," he said, his voice low. "Fools. They are blind. They look for ornamentation, for decoration. They do not understand the beauty of a well-made thing, the elegance of a sound design." He stepped closer, his gaze holding hers. "They see only the surface. I have seen the work, the intelligence, the strength. That is not plain. That is clarity." He reached out, not to take her hand, but to gently touch the emerald necklace at her throat. His fingers were warm against her skin. "This," he said, gesturing to the jewel, "is cold fire. Pretty, but lifeless. You," he said, his eyes meeting hers, "are the real thing. You are the fire itself." The air thickened between them, charged with unspoken words, with the 5 months of silent observation and shared purpose. He had married her as a solution to a problem. She had become the center of his world. "Constance," he said, her name a quiet revelation on his lips. "When I married you, I offered you a contract, a partnership based on mutual utility. You have fulfilled your part of that contract 100 times over. You have restored my house. You have secured my estate. You have defended my name." He took a step back, putting a small but significant distance between them. The gesture was one of respect, of giving her space. "That contract is now concluded. You are free. The debts are paid. Your name is cleared. You could leave Kestrel Chase tomorrow, a wealthy and respected woman in your own right. No one would blame you." Constance stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was offering her an escape. After everything, after they had fought and won together, he was giving her a way out. She thought of her life before Kestrel Chase, the grey, thankless servitude at Bramblehurst. She thought of the cold emptiness of this house when she had first arrived. And she thought of what it had become, a place of order, of quiet purpose, of growing things. A home. Her home.
"Is that what you want?"
she asked, her voice barely a whisper.
"For me to leave?"
"No," he said, the word raw, torn from him. "It is the last thing I want." He took a breath, the confession seeming to cost him a great deal. "Therefore, I must offer you a new contract, one with different terms." He did something then that shattered her composure completely. He went down on one knee. Gideon Crane, the proud, cold Duke of Withercombe, knelt on the stone floor of his ancestral home before the plain woman he had married for convenience. He did not look up at her pleadingly. He looked at the floor, as if gathering his courage. "I am not a man of easy words, Constance. I do not know the language of poets. I know only truth and evidence. And the evidence of my own heart is this. My life before you was a half-life, a gray existence. You have brought color
and order and warmth back into my world, not just to my house, but to me. He finally lifted his head, and his eyes were stripped of all their defenses. They were open, vulnerable, and filled with a feeling she dared not name. The first contract was my proposal. This one must be yours to accept. I am not asking you to be my duchess. You already are. I am not asking you to be the mistress of my house. You have already mastered it. I am asking, plainly, if you will be my wife. In truth, in partnership, in all things. Will you choose to stay? Will you choose me? Tears, hot and unfamiliar, pricked at the back of Constance's eyes. She, who never cried. She had been bought, she had been bartered, she had been valued for her utility. But no one had ever asked her to choose. No one had ever knelt before her and offered her not a rescue, but a partnership, a sharing of the soul. She looked down at this formidable, powerful man who had shown his strength not by commanding her, but by yielding to her, by recognizing her. She thought of all the pretty words and empty promises the world valued. They were nothing compared to this plain, honest, terrifying truth. She knelt down on the floor in front of him, her emerald velvet dress pooling around her, until they were at eye level. She reached out and placed her hand on his cheek. "Gideon," she said, speaking his name for the first time without his title. The word was an intimacy more profound than any kiss. He closed his eyes at her touch. "Plainly," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Yes." 1 year later, Kestrel Chase was a place transformed. The silence that lingered in its halls was no longer the cold, dead silence of grief, but the warm, contented quiet of a well-loved home. It was the silence of a library where two people read side by side, their chairs drawn close to the fire. It was the silence of a garden at dawn, broken only by birdsong and the soft tread of a husband and wife walking hand in hand among the roses. The estate thrived under their joint stewardship. Gideon, with his deep knowledge of the land and his tenants, provided the strategy. Constance, with her meticulous attention to detail and her innate understanding of systems, provided the execution. They were a formidable team, their partnership a source of wonder and respect throughout the county. The story of the disastrous dinner party had become a local legend, a cautionary tale against underestimating a quiet woman. Arabella Sinclair had retired from society, her spirit broken. She had married a much older, very wealthy industrialist from the north and was never seen in the county again. Lady Lavinia, her annuity still paid by the Duke, but her social credit utterly destroyed, had removed herself to Bath, where she lived in reduced circumstances, endlessly complaining to anyone who would listen about her ungrateful, cold-hearted niece. Flora, humbled by the scandal, and finally free of her mother's ambitions, had surprised everyone. She had broken off her engagement to a foppish baronet and had instead married the local vicar, a kind, scholarly man who loved her for her gentle nature, not her pretty face. She was a frequent and welcome visitor at Kestrel Chase, her relationship with Constance slowly healing into a genuine, if quiet, friendship. The sharp-tongued dowager, Theodosia Drummond, had become Constance's staunchest ally and dearest friend. She would visit often, her carriage rattling up the drive, and spend hours with Constance, drinking tea and offering her dry, witty,
and surprisingly wise counsel. "Never thought I'd see Withycombe smile again," she remarked to Constance one afternoon, as they watched Gideon from the window, deep in conversation with a tenant farmer. "You, my dear girl, are a miracle worker, or a very, very good accountant. I suspect it's much the same thing." On the first anniversary of their wedding, a day that had been so cold and contractual, Gideon found Constance in the glasshouses. The space, once derelict, was now a lush, thriving jungle of green. The air was warm and humid, thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming orchids. The Duchess's pride, the plant that had first drawn his attention to her, was in full, glorious flower. Constance was at a potting bench, her hands in the dirt, her face serene. She did not wear the emeralds now, but a simple cotton dress, an apron smudged with soil. She had never looked more beautiful to him. He did not speak, not wanting to break the spell. He simply came up behind her and placed a small, flat, rectangular package on the bench beside her. It was wrapped in brown paper and tied with simple string. Constance wiped her hands on her apron and carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a book. It was bound in dark green leather, soft and supple, the pages of the highest quality vellum. It was a new sketchbook, but as she opened it, she gasped. He had not simply given her a new book. He had had a master bookbinder carefully unstitch her father's old, battered sketchbook and rebind the precious, worn pages into the front of the new volume. Her father's precise drawings and faded notes now sat protected, the first chapter in a new book waiting to be filled. It was an act of such profound understanding, such deep and thoughtful love, that it took her breath away. "Gideon," she breathed, her fingers tracing the familiar lines of her father's handwriting. He came to stand beside her, his arm wrapping around her waist, pulling her close. He bent and kissed the top of her head. "The beginning," he said softly, "and the continuation. Together." Constance leaned back against him, her heart full. She looked from the old pages to the new, from the legacy of the past to the promise of the future. She had been the keeper of her father's book, the silent steward of a dying house. Now, she was the co-author of a new story, a life being written day by day, in partnership with the man she loved. She turned in his arms, her plain face radiant, and lifted it for his kiss. The garden was warm, the house was safe, and their future was a clean, white page, waiting for them to write it, together. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.